Nellie Bly was born Elizabeth Jane Cochran in Cochran's Mills, Pennsylvania in 1864. After her biological father Michael Cochran died on July 18, 1870, her mother remarried J.J. Ford, an abusive drinker whom she would divorce in 1878 when Elizabeth was 14 years old. This experience helped her formulate her views on the reliance on men for finances, divorce, and widowhood. Elizabeth's pen name, Nellie Bly, was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, after Elizabeth read a misogynistic editorial in the Pittsburgh Dispatch entitled "What Girls Are Good For," which boisterously denounced the emergence of women in the workforce and made claims to suggest that the expected duties of a woman were domestic. She wrote a critical response to the editor, George Madden. He, then intrigued by the gumption of the anonymous author, published her letter in the next issue, signing it "Lonely Orphan Girl." On January 17, 1885, Madden took out an ad requesting this mystery girl visit him to discuss a position on the writing staff of the paper. Bly accepted his offer, but dissatisfied with being confined to covering women's topics such as gardening and fashion, she began to cover topics through Immersion journalism and transferred to Joseph Pulitzer's The New York World. Throughout the duration of her career, Nellie Bly became known for her highly publicized trip around the world and other explorations, encountered a myriad of perspectives that helped her impact reform movements, and kick-started the stunt age, setting a precedent for the muckrakers of the early 20th century through her method of exchanging information with the public. Nellie Bly documented several explorations throughout her life, most notably in her books Around the World in 72 Days and 6 Months in Mexico. While still writing for the Pittsburgh Dispatch, she decided that, quote, "I was too impatient to work along at the usual duties assigned women on newspapers, so I conceived the idea of going away as a correspondent." In 1885, accompanied by her mother, 21-year-old Bly traveled to Mexico. The beginning of her time there was spent exploring, until her focus turned to the conditions in which people lived. She started actively attempting to rectify the wrongful perception of Mexicans being, quote-unquote, lazy that Americans held, writing that, from early dawn until late at night, they can be seen filling their different occupations, and that in spite of this, the people were surrounded by death as a result of living in poverty. Bly directs the rest of her attention to recommending tourist locations to visit, revealing the gambling problems plaguing the population, and exposing the political corruption in the government, led by President Porfirio Diaz. She wages war on the censorship preventing the Mexican people from placing their trust in the press, reporting, "All the papers of which I know are subsidized by the government, and, until within several months ago, they were paid to abstain from attacks on the government, so they circulate among foreigners, misrepresenting all Mexican affairs." Bly goes on to say, if a newspaper even hints that government affairs could be bettered, the editors are thrown into prison, too filthy for brutes, until they die or swear never to repeat the offense. She notes that arrests for this offense were quite frequent. Unfortunately, after the Dispatch published one of her writings that addressed the ill treatment of other journalists who had criticized the government, Bly was threatened with her own imprisonment and was forced to leave Mexico and return to Pittsburgh. In 1888, Nellie Bly became inspired by the character Phileas Fogg and his journey in Jules Verne's novel, Around the World in 80 Days. After suggesting the idea of making the same trip in record time to her editor and being denied, she abandoned the notion for a year. In 1889, Bly decided to try again after proving herself through the success of 10 Days in a Madhouse. Upon hearing of this, the business manager for the New York World told Bly that, "It is impossible for you to do it. In the first place, you are a woman and would need a protector, and even if it were possible for you to travel alone, you speak nothing but English, so there is no use talking about it. No one but a man can do this." However, after giving the paper an ultimatum, replying, "Very well, start the man and I'll start the same day for some other newspaper and beat him," her editor permitted that Nellie Bly board the ocean liner Augusta Victoria and leave from New York on her journey around the world on November 14, 1889. Her trip began smoothly as she went from New York to Amiens, France, where she met the author of the book that inspired her expedition. She proceeded on her voyage to Brindisi, Italy, the Suez Canal, and Egypt. But as soon as she reached Hong Kong, a man in the O&O steamship office stopped her and told her about Elizabeth Bisland, who was working for the Cosmopolitan and had begun the same endeavor as Nellie but was granted permission to pay any amount to bribe ships to embark ahead of schedule. Although Bly now knew that her ship would be 5 days behind, she continued on with the knowledge that she was against time, not against Bisland. Nellie Bly arrived in Japan without any complications, and on January 7, 1890, she boarded the Oceanic on her way to San Francisco, where a train would take her back to New York. Nellie Bly reached the city on January 25, 1890, 2 days ahead of schedule, to be informed that she had beaten Elizabeth Bisland, along with the fictional Phileas Fogg, at the time of 72 days, 6 hours, and 11 minutes. Through Nellie Bly's encounters, the marginalized groups of people with whom she worked would reap the benefits brought about by progressivism and humanitarian movements. In Bly's obituary, the Washington Times credited her with promulgating the necessity of repairing corrupt systems in the United States, writing, "She had always appeared on the public platform, in behalf of good movements to which she decided to give her energetic support. She wages a sensational fight against gambling, and more recently wielded her powerful pen in agitation against capital punishment. She heard the cry of homeless boys, the blind, and the destitute, and her forceful articles in their behalf brought about many much-needed reforms."
Somebody has got to be looking at the practices that go on around the country with these very powerful institutions, and that's what investigative journalism is all about. To be an investigative journalism, you got to have a thick skin, you have to be unafraid, you have to have a certain amount of courage, and you got to have really strong scent. Like, it doesn't smell right, so, go after it.
Perhaps the most profound of these was Bly's expose of Blackwell's Island Insane Asylum. After manipulating doctors into pronouncing her mentally ill, she spent 10 days living the life of a patient and recounting her experiences in her book, 10 Days in a Madhouse. Her book found the institution to be in direct violation of the standards put in place by the rules, regulations, and bylaws of the New York State Lunatic Asylum, which required that the said first and second assistant physicians shall carefully observe their condition, wants, and treatment, and see that they have food, medicine, exercise, amusements, clothing, and bedding suitable for them, and that they shall superintend the use of the baths. Bly described the conditions, writing that physicians and nurses would deny patients extra layers of clothing in cold weather, disregard their requests for water, not allow entertainment or knowledge of current events in the world outside the asylum, bathe patients by dumping buckets of cold water over their heads, physically abuse and verbally degrade the women, provide meals of food that was spoiled and nutritionally unfit, and in case of fire would not be able to evacuate patients from the overcrowded building. The outcry that arose after the book's publication brought about the allotment of $1 million in funds toward the care of the mentally ill by the City of New York, and prompted the 16th annual report of the New York State Commissioner in Lunacy to include the statement, "There is a great need that the branch asylum for the insane on Hart's Island be completed at once for the relief of Blackwell's Island Asylum, which is now daily overcrowded to an extent far beyond its capacity and dangerous to the health and welfare of its inmates." Relieving the people she encountered during her exploits from their plights, Bly effected widespread change during an era in which all odds were against it. Nellie Bly's work shaped the future of journalism as a method of communicating with the American people in a unique way, as she bridged the gap between the so-called stunt age of yellow journalism and the muckraker movement that followed. Bly's writing style utilizes sensationalism and subjectivity present in works of yellow journalism, which is shown by her use of eye-catching headlines such as "Working Girls Beware" and "Another Bold Swindle" to draw attention to her articles. These techniques were employed in combination with the defining characteristic of the progressive-era muckraking movement in the early 20th century, namely putting specific reform movements, such as those in women's rights, labor and health and medicine, on the forefront of the public spectacle. Bly also used immersion and investigative tactics prominent in each approach. In a time period during which one style in the press was being exchanged for another, Bly acted as a conduit for the shift in Time magazine's list of top 10 literary stunts, on which Bly's 10 Days in a Madhouse placed. Immersion or stunt journalists, such as herself, were attributed to having, quote, elevated the literary gimmick, "What if I spent a year doing?" to a sometimes galling, occasionally spectacular art form. Throughout the duration of her career, Nellie Bly became known for her highly publicized trip around the world and other explorations, encountered a myriad of perspectives that helped her impact reform movements, and kick-started the stunt age, setting a precedent for the muckrakers of the early 20th century through her method of exchanging information with the public. Her implementation of innovative methods in her compositions altered the landscape of journalism during a phase in history in which this would be crucial to prosperity in the United States. Understanding the challenges posed to her because of her gender, Bly broke down the barriers created for her as a woman and improved the quality of life possible for other disadvantaged peoples, solidifying her title as a feminist icon today.